Torej, zdaj pa vabimo spet naše predavatelje. Naslov tega prispevka je Children and Chronic Sorrow. Zdaj časovno bo tole predavanje do 12:30. Ob 12:30 imamo skupščino, potem ob enih pa kosilo in ob 2 nadaljujemo. Torej, to je od časa. So, dear Rick and Victoria, I did use a few minutes of your time for announcement. Now the floor is yours.
We're back. Yes. We begin with 2 short clips from a film. The title of our presentation is Chronic Sorrow. We're talking again, chronic sorrow in the context of children and families. We're going to show 2 short clips from contemporary films. I'd like you to please watch closely and see as you watch if any particular themes emerge for you about essentially about what it means to be growing up. So if you would watch closely, there are 2 very different clips of films. I'd like to see what you take from each clip. If you see any similarities and what you think about this in terms of our presentation, Chronic Sorrow. Thank you.
Happy birthday to you. Make a wish. Come on, Matt. It can be anything you want, anything in the whole world. Your father is sorry. He had to work. He said he was going to be here, he promised. I know, but he promises that he's going to see you tomorrow. Okay? He's going to be here from his club. Alright? So come on. Make a wish.
What's happening, man?
I do. You're not the loser you were when I first got here, buddy. You're just not used to being a winner.
My father said I was a waste of his time. His money.
Your father was a loser, buddy. My old man was the same way. He spent so much time telling me I was no good, telling me it was nothing. I believed him.
And why are you so pissed off all the time?
Yeah. It's probably got something to do with it. I know how you feel, Willie. You get to the point where you expect to screw up. You expect to fail. If we want to win, we gotta let him go. Forgive him and move on.
Yeah.
Forgive him. Otherwise, we give him too much power over us. And they don't deserve it. Just now. Just now.
What did you hear him say? Nothing. No. That's what I worried. This is on. The young man, he's essentially incarcerated in a treatment facility for angry, violent youth. And that's his counselor. And the young man says, my father said I was a waste of his time and money. My father told me I was worthless. And his counselor says, my father told me the same thing. But my father said the same thing to me, but your father's wrong. You can make it. You can. But you can't keep believing what your father said. You've got to forgive him. You've got to forgive your father and move on. That's what his counselor said. And the young man looks at his counselor and he said, how long did it take you to forgive your father? And his counselor stops. And he puts his head down, he shakes his head, he thinks about it. He's a grown man, and he says, until just now. So this film and the one before describes the experience of children who have been failed, their parents have failed them. Some member of their family has failed them, has rejected them, has left them, has failed them over and over again. The little girl says, please, just this one time, don't let my daddy tell another lie. And that's the introduction to the concept of chronic sorrow for children.
And really what we're talking about, the problem is the sense of rejection on the part of children. And when we talk about rejection, just so that we're all in the same place, we're really talking about the perception, and in many cases the reality, but either one, that by children, that one or both of their natural parents doesn't love them, the fact that they feel not loved. When we talk about rejection, we see three impacts of rejection. They're psychological, social, and emotional. Psychological impact, and this is something we spend a good bit of time in our program talking about, is negative self-evaluation. And that is that when children feel that their parents don't love them, they begin to incorporate the belief that they're unlovable. And so there's a direct connection, we believe, and it's not new for us. I mean, people have been looking at this for some time, that the children who are rejected are almost automatically going to have an issue with self-esteem because they sense that I was unloved because I wasn't worth loving. And so that we have a negative self-evaluation. There's a social impact. Mary Ainsworth talked about insecure working models of how we relate to other people. When we have problems in our early patterns of relationships with our parents, there has been for some time a belief, and we see that recurring over and over, there are problems in the working models that we use in our current relationships. So children not only have psychological issues, there tend to be social issues as a result and interactional issues. And then third is emotional issues. And there's typically two emotions that come with rejection. One is anger. And typically that's not hard to understand because anytime we have a sense of rejection for anything, there's often a sense of anger that goes with that. It can be heard. And as we said earlier, a lot of times, particularly for young people, feelings translate most effectively into anger. So we often see anger, and we often see grief. And certainly, anytime we experience loss, we expect there to be some sense of grief. So we're not talking about pathological issues here, we're talking about normal issues. And then there are behavioral consequences. And that's what often brings our clients into therapy. We see internalizing and externalizing behaviors. In terms of internalizing, people who feel that they're unlovable often feel that they feel ashamed of that. And they feel guilty. I know you may have experienced that too. Children often feel that if they've done something different, then they would have been more lovable. So it's really their fault. It actually can be their fault that the parent left. because of something that they did. So shame and guilt. And then externalizing behaviors. One of the things we see, for children who are missing guidance in their lives, they don't learn how to navigate the social rules. We talked about that earlier in the earlier presentation. They also lack the nurturance when they make mistakes. So as a result, they make more mistakes because they don't know how to navigate, and then when they do make mistakes, there's no one to nurture them. So we see them having externalizing behaviors that can be acting out in all kinds of ways.
Traditional interventions with regard to these concerns are psychological and social impacts. So traditionally, in working with children around chronic sorrow, there's a revision of these internalized representations of self, these internalized representations of self. I'm unworthy, I'm not lovable. That children with traumatic early relationships carry into new relationships with caregivers and ultimately the caregivers themselves. So when they carry this into their relationship with whoever's caring for them, the parent who remains, and they also carry that when they become parents themselves. And the other impact is the identification and correction of negative and caregiver cues that maintain that self-other view. The emotional impact of this is anger. Interventions have stressed the need for children to re-experience and work through their rage. This is an intervention ideally suited or proposed to be suitable for children to work through their rage. And they have to do that before they can successfully enter into a new and capable relationship. There are a variety of, you may have heard of corrective therapies that have been implemented in this regard, including holding therapy. You hold the child until he or she becomes rageful, is held while he or she continues to be rageful until exhausted. They succumb to the holding care, this holding therapy. I won't let you go. I'm going to hold you through your anger. That has been fairly critically reviewed as not a positive method of treatment, in fact considered in some ways potentially unethical. Rage reduction and this notion of rebirthing, a similar experience of holding a child, going through this experience of the trauma of being born anew, to go through that rage and this rebirthing, to be able to come out of it feeling as if he or she has left behind the sorrow and the anger of the loss of the love or the presence of a parent. Grief, a focus on this is a grief, that it is grief that the child is experiencing, and it's treated then as more of a traditional grief model, lessening children's affectional bonds to the rejected parents, an activity or a series of activities in which the child is encouraged to say a formal goodbye to that parent, to let go of that parent, and thus then to be able to move on, no longer feeling as if they are tied to this rejecting or lost parent. Another notion is recovery involving a child's movement through loss, through progressive stages of healing, as one might move through any kind of grief, the loss of any family member or friend, to move through these traditional stages of grief and loss. The shortcomings, however, note that parental rejection may result from a distinct form of emotional suffering, from a perpetual loss that renders traditional notions of grief and loss and thus recovery impossible. The questionable ethics and efficacy of some existing approaches have resulted in calls for really alternative conceptual constructions, conceptual models for understanding and addressing parental rejection. That is, this is an ongoing loss, and these previous models I just mentioned before really do have some ethical concerns and actually have shown no consistent positive outcomes. So what we're introducing today is the concept of chronic sorrow, sorrow that occurs over and over.
Interestingly, what brought us to be interested in this topic was looking at a body of theory that we didn't invent. Actually, the term chronic sorrow was first introduced some time ago in 1964. I'm going to the second part first, by Olhansky, and he was really talking about the kind of distress that's faced by parents who have a chronically disabled child. That is, a child who has some sort of chronic illness that's not going to get better, it's only going to get worse. And that's a unique form of suffering that they go through. Judith Roos in 2002 took this particular concept and expanded it and described it in a way that it wasn't first done. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. What we found, though, was that the type of suffering that some of our young people experience falls better in the context of chronic sorrow than it does in traditional emotions of grief and anger and those types of things. Actually, what Ruth said was that chronic sorrow, it includes three elements, and it's grief, anxiety, and depression. And so what the difference is in chronic sorrow is that the grief doesn't abate over time. That in fact, loss keeps happening over and over again. And that's what makes it unique. We don't go through the normal stages of grief. We continue to experience new grief and loss as we go. Anxiety, it's symptomatic of chronic sorrow. It's similar to anxiety disorder, but the DSM-4 suggests that anxiety disorder doesn't have any precipitating event. In chronic sorrow, it does. Even though, but nonetheless, it is chronic anxiety because the loss continues to happen. So the children we're working with remain anxious over time, not because it's just part of who they are, but it's because of what they're experiencing. And then finally, depression is very similar to that. Anytime we experience loss, it's normal to feel depressed, just to feel depressed. But in the notion of children who we believe have lost part of their life in terms of a parent's presence, they experience that depression over and over and over again. And therefore, even though their depression is not, it doesn't fit chronic depression in terms of the DSM-4, in terms of being the result of bereavement, it does seem to look like that because they remain depressed for a long time, over and over. Move on to that.
We see the potential advantages of the notion of chronic sorrow as a more accurate and comprehensive understanding of the impact, the emotional impact of parental rejection. When Rip noted that it's a sorrow that happens over and over again, every birthday, every holiday, every time a child who's been rejected by a parent is in the presence of children with parents who are involved and engaged, every time a parent makes a promise to come and fails, every time there's an event, a graduation, an elevation to some important life shift, perhaps even when children are becoming adults and perhaps marry, have children, the rejecting parent, the absent parent, again and again, experience chronic sorrow. There's an ongoing loss and chronic sorrow that appears irreconcilable. It's also an alternative to coercion for breaking through the emotional defenses against further rejection. That is, it's an alternative to this coercion is a model that has been used before. So that's why I think we see this as a model that both makes sense theoretically, is grounded in the literature of grief and loss, but is attenuated specifically to the kind of grief and loss experienced by a child who interprets a parent's rejection as the fault of her or himself. Putting perpetual loss and consequent suffering into perspective for the child and the caregivers, we begin to see that in terms of addressing grief, we begin to consider it companionship versus closure. We know that a child may never come to complete closure over this loss, and thus we can offer as counselors companionship to the child throughout childhood and into adulthood, companionship, being present to the pain, being present to the power of that pain in the context of this child's life. So it's companionship. It's also offering what Jeffries has called exquisite witness. Again, the capacity of the counselor to provide witness to the pain, sorrow, and challenge of this extraordinary loss in the life of a child. It also revises these negatively saturated personal fables. That is, children have these personal fables that if I had only been able to do better, that this is this is my fault. I wasn't a good enough child. My father would come back. My mother would return. If I could be a better child, if I could be a better person. And it's also the opportunity to do this unpressured storytelling to counterbalance the successes, to balance the successes against the failures. That is, to have the opportunity to tell stories of opportunities when the child succeeded, when the child was received with love and care from those in her life, or when a child made some extraordinary achievements and coped with the ongoing loss. So we can tell stories about the child's experience and have the child tell stories about the experience that help revise that life perspective that I am worthless, that I'm not worth caring about. Like the young man said in the film, you know, my father always told me that I was going to grow up to be nothing, you know, that I was not going to be worthwhile. And so a story to revise that, as his counselor was beginning to do with him. It also addresses anxiety, addresses the real life insecurities in addition to symptom reduction, crisis preparation and management. Perhaps we can begin to talk to children about an upcoming holiday, an upcoming event, an upcoming birthday, and prepare, anticipate and prepare the anxiety management. We can also offer emotional respite. That is, it may be an opportunity for the child to be engaged in another activity or go to a different setting in order to be able to manage being able to take a break from the emotional context of the ongoing loss. And also, it's important for us to link families to community resources because families are not going to be able to, the maintaining families, the parent or parents who are involved with this child also struggle with the child's behavioral struggles, the child's rejection, the child's anger. This is an ongoing concern, and the parent or parents who remain are the ones who are responsible for ongoing care of a child who will be angry, who will be demanding, who will experience anxiety and depression, and often blame the surviving parent, the parent who's still there, the parent who's still present, blame that parent and say, my dad would be here if it weren't for you. My mom would come back if you hadn't been mean to her. And even though the child may not believe that, that's a way for the child to manage the circumstances, to make sense of the experience. It's very difficult also for the remaining parent or caregivers to be able to manage the child's acting out behavior over and over and over again. It's extremely stressful, and they too need emotional respite, and they too need community resources to support them in managing and supporting the family in this context. It's also important for us to address depression, reframing alternatives to rejection, that is the feeling and doing components of love. It's also important for us to maximize children's association with positive sources of affirmation through positive parental communication and also through community mentorship. It may be particularly important for children who are struggling with chronic loss to have positive relationships in the community with others who will give them affirmation, who will offer them self-respect, and also let them know how much they are cared for. Finally, helping children restore a sense of control in their lives through structure, that is, providing a structured environment and helping them to begin to anticipate when they might experience difficulty with, again, anniversaries, birthdays, and so forth, and also engagement in helping activities. Not only in counseling, but other kinds of helping activities that affirm a child's sense of self-worth.
One thing I wanted to mention just before I move into this is the notion of companionship versus closure. And one of the things that really struck us about this is that, and I mentioned earlier that as therapists, particularly in America, we are more and more outcome driven. And therefore, when we move into this, but I think all of us have this notion we want to be successful. We want to see progress. And when we're working with the notion of chronic sorrow, we have to give some of that up. We have to realize that the loss is ongoing. And so we need to be aware that companionship versus finding closure or outcome may be the best we're going to get, and is what's needed. I wanted a gentleman by the name of Albert Trashman some years ago talked about the need for us as therapists to consider other than just the hour that we're in therapy and look at the other 23 hours of the day. And so one of the things we have to look at, and what the notion of chronic sorrow has helped us look at, is what we need to do to prepare families to deal with the other 23 hours that they're not with us. And so one of the things we have to help them with is we have to help families and parents and caregivers understand that there is no foreseeable end to perpetual loss. As Victoria said, every birthday, every holiday is a new loss. We start a new grieving process. The Kubler-Ross grief process begins over again. So I may be at a higher stage in terms of this loss, but now I go back to another stage. We have to help families see that. We have to extend our care to our treatment has to go beyond just the formal counseling relationship, which is what we're talking about. With the caregivers, that is the family members, we have to help them understand that they're not only, it's interesting, that parent who is still at home with the child is no longer just a parent. If rejection is involved and chronic sorrow is involved, we as counselors, as therapists, are actually helping parents be therapists because they have to help deal with that notion of chronic sorrow. We're asking more of parents than to be parents. They have to be therapists, and we have to help them. We need to empower them. One way we can do that is to help them understand what they're dealing with and give them the skills to work with. For example, a number of the skills that we talked today would apply here about earlier today. We have to be teachers of our parents to apply those clinical skills if they're going to deal with their child in the other 23 hours. And most of all, what we have to do is honor them. We have to honor what they're dealing with because just like we have to honor a caregiver who's dealing with a chronically ill individual whose life is changed by the fact that they're going to be dealing at a time without end with the needs of that person. A caregiver is going to be dealing with the needs of a rejected child in much the same way.
You did it. I'm sorry. Questions or comments about this presentation? Questions or comments? I think we have a few minutes before the food is ready.
We do have 10 minutes, we have then assembly and
Did it seem as if it was familiar to you? When you think about working with children who have suffered rejection of a parent, did it seem familiar to any of you? So it felt as if you might have seen this before? I see a few folks nodding, looking confused. Yes.
May I ask, how does it look when the child faces rejection but parents are still present or there?
Oh.
Is that something that you're seeing here?
I mean, I wondered how
Well, I think that one of the things that we mentioned is that rejection is the perceived or real. And I can only go back to a personal experience where I will say to it right now that most of the families that we see at our clinic, the parents are not there. But that doesn't mean that, and that's where we go back, when the parent's not there, the potential for the rejection to be real is greater. But it's also perception. And so in families where, for many, many reasons, a child can perceive rejection and can perceive that he or she is not loved due to circumstances in the family, be it job demands, be it discord between the parents in a family. If a child perceives that, then it can still be there. And so we see less of that because we actually wish we saw more intact families that came in because then you've got both parents to work with. But it can be either way. We have seen it, we do see it, and it's quite possible that a child can feel rejected in a family that is. Just very quickly on that, in my own experience of working with children, one of the more difficult children that I've worked with, his father, he came from an intact family, and his father was the chief of staff at a major hospital in the city where he was. So they weren't a family of poverty, but there was enough discord in the family that young man clearly felt himself to be rejected and clearly felt himself to be unworthy of that and responsible, and it came out of his behavior.
I would mention that there's been some indication that families who are struggling around issues of immigration and then dislocation, that children who are separated from their families, for example, a father who goes to another country to secure a job, generate income, and then hopefully later to bring the family along, that they experience. Many of these children who come to the new country to join the father after many years of absence, even though the father is sacrificing on behalf of his family, it's a family decision for the father to go and try to secure a job, generate the income to bring the family to a new country. Those children often not only are experiencing dislocation because of immigration, but have experienced a sense of chronic loss and thus experience chronic sorrow that is often then evaluated as depression, anxiety, and often, as we know, young children who feel depressed and anxious often act out. And so they're considered as angry, aggressive children without the context of the ongoing loss of a parent who was absent during a particular period of time. And the children can hear, yes, your father's out doing this for you, but they experience as loss over and over and over again. So I think that's an interesting point as well. As our countries change, as immigration changes, and also families where children whose parents are in the military and gone over and over and over again. That might also be an experience, even if the father wants to be engaged. It's not always fathers. I don't want to suggest that. So mothers often leave children, are unavailable, and so the experience of chronic loss would really be with regard to any parental figure who is unable to meet the obligations of parenthood in a consistent way.
Just a little aside from that is that early in our careers, we found ourselves working with more orphans, and we don't work with many orphans as we used to. That is, children whose parents are deceased. And what we found was that, and at least in my early work with orphans, there was less of a feeling of rejection sometimes, because even if they had been, they could always imagine that their parents loved them. They could imagine that they did. And remember, it's a perception thing. Whereas it's really different for children whose parents are alive and are not with them. It's a very different experience with that, and that's what we're dealing with. And if we can leave anything for you to take with you, it's the notion that as therapists, as Victoria said, it's really important for us in working with children to realize that we're not necessarily looking for, again, the magic bullet, the silver bullet that's going to be the solution. It's going to be an ongoing process, and that requires a change in our own perspective.
This might be particularly useful when we begin to encounter families with adolescents, young boys and young girls who are acting out in particular ways. We might think that it's the absence of family structure or the absence of a father that is leading a young girl to engage in early sexual behavior, to behave inappropriately, without thinking about that notion of chronic sorrow. And that young men who are also acting out in angry ways, I think introducing the idea of sorrow helps us understand perhaps a little bit more about the emotional experience of children, so that when we encounter these children as little kids, as younger children, perhaps that notion of chronic sorrow, like the young woman, the little girl, with her birthday cake. The young man that we saw before, he was in a corrective facility. He was basically in jail. And this might be the first time that someone had introduced a notion of him as someone who was sorrowful. So perhaps more early intervention, for us to have an awareness of that in an earlier time, will give us the opportunity to be persistent and also to be supportive of families, to provide a framework for understanding children's behavior well before they might reach that age, older age, when they're at greater risk. And perhaps it also might, it certainly seems to have given me, I think, a more caring perspective, to be more insightful, and not to be so quickly judgmental. The notion of chronic sorrow seems to be, to me, very powerful, and perhaps it will encourage all of us to use that notion of empathy before we are quick to judge behavior. Thank you.
One question more. When do you believe it's the right thing to do to include medication?
What do you think?
I think one of the things that we should, we're moving quickly through this material, but I think one thing that we would say is that the traditional treatments are saying that chronic sorrow may be a part of this, does not except for the coercive parts that Victoria talked about, the rage therapy, those have pretty well shown not to be useful. But the traditional treatments for depression and for grief and anxiety, medication, we are not saying that those are not to be used for that. We're saying that we need to look beyond just those. And so we're not saying it's either or. We're saying that it can be supplemental to that. It is important for us to, again, consider the natural causes of what's happening in addition and not only treat the symptoms with medication.
And also to avoid pathologizing the child. You know, it's something that's happened to the child, and so to avoid pathologizing, to understand that this is probably a natural consequence of the loss of a parent and ongoing rejection. Different than death. Different than death. And so this ongoing rejection, it makes sense that a child would feel that way. So medication may still be warranted, but that we don't pathologize it and say to the child, you're sick, you know, this is your fault. So I think that's a really helpful question.